Scammers steal billions of dollars every year, one person at a time. Anyone can be a target. Lives are ruined, families shattered, and it can start with one text. Welcome to Stolen, with former prosecutor Erin West.
I started thinking about the scamdemic back in March 2022 when we saw our first victim at the React task force. This was a man who was a 30-year-old software engineer who had stolen from his entire nest egg. And I haven't stopped thinking about the scamdemic since. But one of the things I did early on is I got out a piece of butcher paper and I put it on my kitchen island and I started writing down what we needed to move forward. And one of the things that was obvious to me is that we needed a strategy and we needed some buy-in to that strategy. What I love about this space is that I'm not the only one in it anymore. It felt very much when I was creating that piece of butcher paper that there weren't very many people who cared about this. But as I sit here in mid-2026, there's an army of people who are very much in the business of trying to fix what's happening. And you're about to meet one of them today. Today I talked with Kate Griffin, and she and her team at Aspen Institute brought together 80 entities to create a blueprint, a strategy, a national strategy for what we should do about the scamdemic. It's an important piece of work. Their remit was clear. They were here to create the strategy. They were not here to put it into action. But now, step 2, they're looking at how do they do that. So I invite you to listen to how this came to be, where the difficulties are in reaching consensus, and what were the issues they grappled with. I hope that it will give you some comfort to know that perhaps things are moving at what I consider a glacial pace, but perhaps there is also work being done in the background that you just may not know about yet. And that's the kind of work you'll hear about from Kate today. Enjoy. In a world where the scamdemic is increasing by double digits year on year on year, it's important to take a minute to think about tech solutions and what can be done to make this more difficult, more expensive, more time-consuming for these dirty actors to do their business. And when I think of tech solutions, I'm particularly grateful to 2 of them who believe in Stolen and believe in facing this epidemic head-on, and that's Scamnetic and BioCatch. I'm grateful to both of them for supporting this podcast. Scamnetic works in the background to stop these scams before they even get to you. And BioCatch, they're using biometric behavioral indicators to call out scammers also before they get to you. Thank you so much to these 2 companies who've been with me for nearly a year. You're appreciated. And for all of you listening, take a look. Scamnetic.com, biocatch.com. When was the first time you realized that this problem existed, that there was so much money being stolen?
Yeah. So it sort of crept in slowly and then all at once. So and this is related to how we came to kind of take this idea or an approach of a national strategy. We'd worked for a number of years. There's a broader issue around financial inclusion, or how do people access and use a broad range of financial services, basic banking, savings accounts, different kinds of credit. How do they use them to fuel their own everyday lives and their hopes and dreams? It's a broad category of things that we call financial inclusion. Well, we were working with a set of industry and nonprofit leaders alongside the federal government to craft the US's first ever national financial inclusion strategy. That was released in October of 2024 by the Treasury Department. And in the course of doing that, we asked some really hard questions around, for those of us who'd been working on that topic for a very long time, what were some of the stickiest, hardest problems to solve for, that if we could just unlock those levers, all of this work on financial inclusion would get easier. And fraud came up in the course of that conversation in a way that was like, what?
Right.
And it was a couple of dynamics of it, and fraud being talked about in this context broadly, not only scams, but that being a subset of it, but that it's an issue that financial institutions are spending a lot of money on combating. The cost of serving lower income, lower balance accounts is one where the cost to serve, and when there's a large cost center like fraud, that matters. And so that was one element of it, sure. But it also had to do with what rising amounts of fraud and scams was doing to people's trust in the financial system, their decisions about how and when to engage, and how they trusted institutions with their hard-earned money. And it had the issue then, of course, of how much money was then leaving the system, that people were losing, as you know, really life-altering amounts of money. And so that's really how it kind of came to our attention. And then as the heat was sort of rising in the summer of 2024, a number of partners came to us, largely from the financial services sector, and said, this work that you've just done to gather a group of people and build a national strategy, could you apply that to scams? And that's really what got the ball rolling for us.
That's amazing. We come at this from different angles. And so I don't have visibility to how this was causing so much turmoil within financial institutions. I saw it from, I've got human beings coming to me en masse that had life-changing amounts of money stolen from them. And so to me, I was seeing it very much from a person on the ground perspective of, this has got to stop. This is being done by transnational organized criminals, and this is so much bigger than what people are understanding. This is not the Nigerian prince. This is not minor amounts of money being stolen. Tell me a little bit about, and help me understand how this was hurting financial institutions, or what their issues were that they were coming to you with.
Yeah, really, one of the things that I hate to say that I really enjoy this work, because obviously we're working on something that's really difficult.
But it's important. Yes.
Right, yes. It's fascinating to me every day to get to learn from the different perspectives that people bring to this.
Yes.
Problem, right. I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as hurting financial institutions, and
okay,
perhaps that one way, but essentially they were saying, like, we are having customers come to us. They're saying this, this money has been stolen, and we can talk about the reasons for why they might or might not reimburse, what the rules say about when they would give the money back. But essentially they were saying, like, we're a little stuck here because when a customer comes and authorizes that payment, we may have some suspicions. We don't actually know who they were talking to, who they got a text from, what other platforms they were engaging in. And so when they tell us a story about what they're using that money for, we don't have any information to tell them any better. That's the problem, that if we want to have any conversations about how we reduce the incidence of this, make it happen less often for people, make it less devastating, and or get to a place where people could ultimately get more of their money back, we have to solve for that. We can't be the ones sort of only doing this work. And so that was really kind of the premise of the very early days of that conversation from that perspective. I will say very quickly, as soon as we started sort of saying, like, okay, well, great. If you're talking about this as a text message or social media or email or all the other pieces of this, who's working on this? And the doors blew open and everybody was like, I want in. Who's helping? How do we organize?
Yeah. So let me get to that in a minute, because I want to go back to financial institutions for a sec. I just gave a presentation immediately prior to this to a major financial institution, and I was talking about where they sit in the life cycle of pig butchering and how difficult it is at where they are sitting to be the ones to actually affect the major change. What they have is someone who has been groomed for 4 months and who has been led to believe that banks are the bad guys. They're going to stop you from moving your money. They're jealous. They don't want it to go into cryptocurrency. So make up this lie, do it this way. And banks are stuck in, or financial institutions are in a place where it is your money and you can move it. And we do our desperate best to help you understand that this is likely a scam and you are likely to lose this money. What do you see as the places where financial institutions could really make a positive impact in the scamdemic?
They are really showing up and trying to explore how they can have partnerships across sectors to help get more information so that they can earlier, or as soon as a customer comes to them and they have sort of a bit of suspicion, or they may know even earlier, to be able to put more warnings and interventions in front of folks to say, okay, here's why we think this might be a problem. Now, Granted, we know that there's an incredible amount of grooming happening, and the criminals are finding they're going to learn that script and quickly have another script for their customer. And yet, I think we're trying to get smarter and better at how we think about the messages that matter. So that's one, is sort of how do we make sure that they've got better data information and are better armed from a regulatory standpoint as well. I think continuing to kind of push against what are the frameworks under which they can pause, slow, or freeze a transaction.
Right.
That's another critical area so that the money isn't moving so fast.
Yeah.
Now, I have to caveat that, Erin, with to say that like everything I've done in my life to date
Has been to speed up money.
has been to speed up the payment
Oh
system.
my gosh. Exactly. You
Right?
want it to be frictionless.
Well-
If I want to move money, I should be able to move it quickly.
And especially for a low income person living on a thin margin, like having money caught in the system is the worst thing ever. But having that money stolen would be worse. And so it's been quite the
it's
quite
it's
the
a
reckoning.
lot to grapple with.
Yeah, it's quite the reckoning. And so those are some of the areas where certainly there's a role that they can play around consumer education and awareness, but it's really the intervention point that I think is really important. And then also, I mean, at the end of the day, criminals have bank accounts too. So helping to do more to identify those mule accounts and shut them down. This bleeds over into a fraud ecosystem in that sometimes the criminals are doing account takeover and taking over, customers' accounts. And so how do they get better information and help to take those things down in a way that the customer, is not as victimized either. So yeah, the chain seems to be never ending, but then also what are they feeding to law enforcement to help build cases, to help make sure that we can take down more? And then also what are the loops that they can then feed back into the sectors that are earlier in the system to say, hey, by the way, these are the mule accounts we found, or this is the activity we're seeing on our platforms. If you're seeing that there, let's make sure there's a connection and you can take things down earlier so there aren't more victims from this case.
I feel like there are an infinite number of ways of baby steps forward that could be taken in so many different sectors. And it's to me, it's all about just taking that step forward. Before we dive more into this, I want to hear more about how the project got put together. Were you tasked with it from Aspen? Did they come to you and say, Kate Griffin, we got a job for you?
Our team at the Financial Security Program is well known for pulling together a group of people who maybe have divergent viewpoints in a productive dialogue, right? How do we kind of break through those tensions and find places where we have common ground and build something from that? So we've got a reputation for being able to do that on our team. And because the work I'd done on the financial inclusion strategy had included the work on fraud, it landed on my desk and my team's desk.
That's kind of your superpower, isn't it? Being able to bring a group together and to somehow navigate this into something that people can agree upon?
A little bit, yeah.
How'd you get there? How did you learn how to do that? I think that's a skill that we can all benefit from.
Yeah, that's
not just so much the convening, but once they're in the room, you and I were just in a room recently where there's people with all kinds of their own personal agenda, what matters to their specific entity. How do you build that skill to get them to compromise, to give and take?
Yeah, I'd say there's a couple components to it. One of the values that we hold dear on our team, like a cultural value, is to ask curious questions.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah. And it's a really good one when
it's a really good one.
Yeah. When you see a lot of, on the face of it, divergence of opinions or deeply held beliefs, to really start to continually ask curious questions to kind of understand what's underneath it and what's underneath that and what's underneath that. It helps to uncover where common ground might be.
It's a good life skill.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I try to teach it to my children too.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. Okay, so you get tasked with this, and what are your first steps? You've been given, quite frankly, what to me, where I sit, is the most important thing that is happening in the world of finance, in the world of human beings. But I'm sure there are other things that are also important. But really, you're given a huge task.
Right.
And so what are your first steps? How do you figure this out?
Well, I mean, first was to figure out who's on the bus, who wants to be on this bus, who needs to be on this bus.
Right.
And so really, I mean, we were kind of given a long list of like folks who'd expressed some early interest. We spent the first couple of months figuring out who's on the bus and what were their deeply held beliefs and where was their heat and momentum. literally through one-on-one calls with what would become the 80 different member institutions of
Yeah.
this task force. I had a
Uh-huh.
great team. I have a great team of folks. It
Uh-huh.
wasn't all just me. And we really spent some time trying to understand how people viewed the issue, where they thought the most critical things we needed to solve for early on were, what the barriers were to their own ability to do more, sort of kind of constructing, kind of getting a sense of where everybody was sitting.
Mm-hmm.
And so we took that and said, okay, what we're hearing is that there's kind of heat and momentum around, at the time, 4 different issue areas. So let's, to get started, let's at least kind of organize people into these 4 different conversations, because we know that that's where they're excited to get to work. We don't have to convince them that it's a problem. And do that. And so we spent about 3 months or so in kind of these 4 working groups to get the ball rolling. And because many of the folks who ultimately signed up to do this, again, didn't know the financial security program at Aspen, they also had to get to know us and trust us as sort of
Right.
stewards of this work. And so that was a good way to do that.
What was the objective when you started the project?
Yeah. So the objective was a couple of fold that all led to what's a national strategy, right? It was one around how do we frame this around a focus on prevention,
Mm-hmm.
right? How do we think about this in terms of at every step in the process of when a scam sort of progresses through this life cycle, how could it have been prevented? And so it was getting kind of this group of individuals and institutions to kind of put that hat on and think through that lens. It was to think about all of the levers, whether that was things that the private sector could do or things that were needed to be done in policy or in executive action. So all the different kind of public sector levers that could be taken, and to kind of amass that together into a comprehensive blueprint, if you will.
So what were the 4
The initial
working
4 working
areas? Yeah, tell
the
me.
initial 4 working groups. So it is no surprise that the highest and number one thing on everyone's list was data sharing, information sharing.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you could have guessed that right out the bat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so let me say what they were, and then I can talk a little bit about
Sure. That
process.
sounds great. Yeah.
So information sharing. So across sector within private sector information sharing.
Okay.
2 was how do we have a better relationship and get work done with law enforcement? So private sector with law enforcement.
Yep.
3 then was how do we improve our capabilities around consumer awareness, warning, and disruption?
Okay.
And then 4 was how do we solve the problem of measuring the problem?
These are the it's funny because earlier when you said to me, the financial institutions were coming to us and saying that this was a big problem, I was already in my head, I was like, well, how were they measuring it? Well,
Yeah.
how were they measuring it at that time?
Yeah.
They could sense it was a big problem. Okay, fascinating. Well, let's before we get into the nuts of it, you convene these 4 groups, you get the people in them and you get them talking. Are you meeting in person?
We did once. A lot of it was virtual. And
Okay.
then we brought everybody together for one kind of half day in person to kind of, after probably 2 or 3 meetings, then it was like, no, okay, you've gotten it all out of your systems. Let's get some work done together in a room.
I love it.
So we had 1 week in January where we had all 4 of them meet at one day. Our team was exhausted.
I bet you were. It's interesting because your remit wasn't necessarily to fix it. Your remit was to draft the strategy that would enable someone to take the action. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's definitely fair to say. And honestly, I think one of the byproducts of this, both the working groups and the broader strategy piece, was to get people even to understand the problem in the same way.
Yes.
Like,
yes.
could we all agree on what the problem
What the problem is? Yes.
Yeah. And and that's more than just the data, like how big is the size of the problem, but literally do we all agree that this is a cross-sector problem? That it's through a collaborative sort of multi-sector approach that we have to fix this. And it seems sort of, simple to say that out loud, but I think some of the starting point where we were at was a lot of pointing fingers. Like if only that person would do it,
Right.
then we would solve this problem, rather than if we collectively all do our own work and our work together in arms, then we will start to solve this problem. So that was a big shift.
Was one of the 4 the easiest to work with? Did one come together easier than others?
I think that's a great question. It depends on what dimension. I would say that data sharing probably had the most people wanting to go gung ho and fix it.
Yeah.
But it was also the one that, like, as soon as you scratch underneath that, you realize that everyone's talking past each other. Like, what data are we talking about? For what purpose? Shared in
And
what
then
way?
throw all the law in.
Right.
Yes.
And what are the legal barriers, right? So that's
Yeah.
what I think when it comes to the work around consumers and the consumer awareness piece, we fundamentally had two different conversations happening at the same time and kind of split it out into two subgroups. So one was really around like awareness and campaigns.
Yep.
And the other was around just in time at the point of intervention.
Yeah.
How do we actually do one-on-one work with a customer? What's the best messaging? How do you break the spell, et cetera? And I would say in both of those instances, we have really dedicated professionals and a lot of incredible researchers trying to do their best to make sure that we understand what is and isn't working.
What's actually working.
Consumer awareness. Yeah.
Right. I think not everybody agrees on what is actually helpful. Like, is a massive campaign, is billboards the way to do this? I've heard you personally say that you think the just in time is probably the effective methodology.
Some of that is driven by the previous work that we've done around financial education and how do you think about consumer behavior change, right? Mass consumer behavior change is a really difficult thing to achieve. And I want to preface all of this by saying sophisticated transnational criminal operations, like I don't ever want to put all of this at the foot of the consumer. So I just always want to say that first.
For sure, yes. Thank you for saying that. We're up against a horrible enemy that is very skilled. Yes.
Yeah.
With that in mind.
You know, there was some early evidence that I saw the FINRA Investor Education Group put on this great conference as I was sort of starting to get into this with the researchers talking about some of their education research. And it was really interesting to see the sort of effects of some of the campaign work, sort of how long does that actually last in people's minds. It's not as long as you want it to be for the amount of money being put in to those kinds of campaigns. We see similar things in terms of financial education, right? Limited lasting effect. But if you're doing it at the point of somebody actually taking action and you can influence that action that's being taken, it not only sort of has the impact that you want around sort of that behavior in that moment, but also has some lasting impact in terms of them then knowing that for a second time. So I think those are some of the important things to remember. There's also, of course, the sophistication of these criminals that are preying on very emotional reactions to things, right? The amygdala effect. And so that's also why I sort of worry about an over-indexing on education.
That makes sense. I think that there is so much interest in this space now, and there's so many people who want to be helpful, but I don't know that we've all agreed on what would be the most helpful yet. So it's funny to see some things seem very effective that could be done that aren't being done, and other things seem a lot of work being done on, but maybe they're not even that effective. So it seems as though part of your work had to be trying to understand scientifically what would even make the most difference.
So that's actually where the measurement group kind of took us. There was some element of the work on measurement that had to do with how do we size and scope the problem.
Right.
And how do we look at trends and see trends over time? But we put out a measurement framework and there's a big chunk of it that is, and how effective are we?
Right.
And at scam prevention work, how do we actually know whether the investments we're making on scam prevention are having a desired impact?
Right.
And so we have a measurement framework that is in the final paper and that gets at that. But I fundamentally think that as we go forward, there's more work to be done and more transparency to be had around the effectiveness of interventions across the entire ecosystem, right? No matter the sector that we're in.
I have still so many questions. So let's think about these 4 pillars and how would you describe the document that you produced? Are these suggestions? Are these prescriptions? How do you describe them?
Sure. We call it a blueprint.
That makes sense to me. I like a blueprint. Okay.
Yeah, we call it a blueprint. And essentially from the 4 working groups, we then sort of said, okay, honestly, whether it was on topic or off topic, we have so much fodder here to really start crafting kind of what the theoretical framework is and what the final recommendations will be. And so we then just started writing pieces of it and convening different kind of groups of task force members to give us feedback. And that was just a write and iterate process.
Right.
And then we gave ourselves a deadline because we could have done that really for years.
For sure. And what was your deadline? When not your deadline, but like when was this shown to the world? It
was shown to the world at the very, very end of September 2025.
Okay. So we're 9 months in?
We're 9 months into this being in the world.
Yeah.
And the thing that was produced is a meaty and 70-page document of recommendations.
It is. It is
It
a
is.
thick tome. It is
It
a
is.
volume.
It
But
is.
but it's a major problem that has major this is not a one we do one thing and that fixes it. And
Yeah.
it's funny, one of the things that really irritates me the most is when you're at an event and someone will say, "Well, we can't legislate our way out of this. Well, we can't arrest our way out of it." And it's, no, we 100% cannot, but we need to be legislating. We need to be advocating. We need to be arresting all pieces of
All of
this
it.
and all of it all the time.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go to data sharing. Give me an example of some of the blueprint material for what we should be doing about data sharing.
Yeah. I mean, from a like just the highest level set of principles,
Sure.
if we know that the criminals are sort of starting on one platform, which is where they
Mhm.
initially meet a victim,
Mhm.
and then they're going to hop to another platform for some other communications, and then they're
Mhm.
going to hop to one, two, or three or four different payment methods from
Right.
gift cards and cash to gold bars and crypto, right? Every one of those is a different company who is only seeing what's happening between those two parties for a small window of time,
Yep.
right? So the question is, how much can we knit together that information?
Mhm.
And how much can we do that actually gives maybe the next person down the chain enough signal, if you will,
Right.
enough intelligence to stop it?
Mhm.
What would that look like? And so, there's principled stuff in there in terms of like, we all need to invest in doing this more. We need to invest both in the technologies that allow for it, but also invest in the pilots to see what data it is that gives us the best
That
signal,
matters.
that
Mhm.
gives us the ability to take down. We're still like in the Wild West here in terms of like what that is. We like to talk a
Right.
lot about data sharing, but we actually need to talk a lot about more about what data sharing matters.
Mhm.
So that's we get into some of those things. We talk about the legal barriers that exist. And I think one of the things that we tried to highlight quite clearly is, or as clear as we could, is that for every one of these different sectors, they're operating under very different legal environments.
Yes.
So you have a highly regulated environment for financial services,
Yes.
which has an ability to share data for fraud and scam prevention purposes
Mhm.
with other financial institutions, which is what the 314B of the Patriot Act provides, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
But that is a walled garden, if you will, right?
Yes. Uh-huh.
And doesn't solve the problem of cross sector data sharing.
Right.
And so the telecommunications industry has sort of what they have. Parts of the technology industry don't really have a sort of regulated environment in which to think about this other than how it might touch upon issues around consumer data privacy. And depending on what kind of data we're talking about, that it may not even touch consumer data rights, right? So these are a whole swath of issues, and none of these legal systems talk to each other. And there's highly different incentives
Mhm.
for whether and how to participate
Yes.
in this stuff, right? It's a cost to a company to share
Yes.
data, ingest
Yes.
data, use
Mhm.
that data, right? And those incentives look very different depending on what that does for the institution. So it depends on the business models of those sectors. It depends on how the customer harm is showing up on those platforms, what kind of reputational risk is posed for that institution or sector. All of those things look different.
Yeah, I was thinking about how difficult it is to compel participation in a situation like that. And so it got me thinking back to when you were bringing together your original 80 some groups or 80 some entities involved. Was it pretty easy to get people to come to the table, or were there people where you had to reach out and say, "Hey, we really need you at the table"?
Ultimately, what we created was an advisory body. Like the task
Mhm.
force is advisory, and we were really clear, and it's clearly stated in the document, like everything in there. We had asked at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program are the authors. This was not a document that all of the legal teams of all of those 80 institutions signed off on,
Right.
right?
Right.
They are not co-signatories or co-authors of that institute. And that was helpful in terms of for any institution that was a little bit nervous
Yeah.
what participation in this dialogue would mean.
Right.
The other thing that we do, all of these dialogues were held under Chatham House rule, an ability, creating and fostering an ability to kind of speak as plainly as they could about both what they'd been learning, what they were seeing, et cetera. So those two things helped a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes for institutions that had known Aspen before and known the kinds of conversations and dialogues that we do, it was an easier yes, I think. But, what I was really delighted by or surprised by is that even though it became very clear that this is our document, certainly there are parts of it that certain task force members would still say, well, these 3 sentences I didn't agree with, or those two, and
Right.
that's fine.
Right.
We've had that conversation.
Right.
One of the things that happened when we released the document was we actually did a letter to Congress that said it was to congressional leadership, to the heads of the committees that would need to be looking at this, and essentially said, like, America needs a national strategy for fighting scams.
Yes.
We urge you to look at this document
Mm-hmm.
and the work of this task force. And I think fully half of the member institutions signed their names to that, which was really exciting. We were really, happy to deliver that. And it's, been very useful in the conversations that we have when we go to Congress.
What's the response been from the Hill?
Yeah. So listen, congressional representatives are hearing from their constituents all day, every day. They know this is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And in my own career, I've never been a Hill policy person
Mm-hmm.
necessarily, but I have never talked to the Hill so much because they call all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Something like 26 different bills have been introduced this Congress alone. I think I've seen another dozen in draft, and there's more out there, I'm sure. A third of Congress has endorsed a bill related to scams this Congress, and it's split down the middle, Democrats and Republicans, fully bipartisan.
Truly bipartisan.
Truly bipartisan. So all of that is super exciting momentum. They're really wanting to do something. And also there's a bipartisan Stop Scams caucus that is growing. But I would say that it is still lacking a concerted strategy. I think we have an opportunity as a scam prevention field to do more to point them in some specific directions because those bills do 100 different things. And so the opportunity is there for us to seize it.
You've brought up something that's really interesting. So I would say that to date, there's been sort of a patchwork of very interested parties kind of doing their own thing, each doing important work from their own perspective. But it feels like when you say the Hill could use some guidance, is there an opportunity to start bringing some of the participants who've looked at this together to start saying, hey, here are the people who are really in the soup, and here are a couple things we can agree on. Here's a couple ways to move forward.
Yeah. I think there is a good opportunity to do that. I think some of the nonprofits, ourselves included, are willing and excited to participate in and engage in those conversations where, Aspen's not a lobbyist. We don't sort of lobby.
No.
And so we're trying to make sure we skirt that
It's a very,
line
yes. Mm-hmm.
appropriately. Right.
Yeah.
But I think you make a good point. I think the opportunity is there. And there's definitely, in the nonprofit space, some incredible leaders who have been very thoughtful about the ways that they provide, guidance and technical assistance to the Hill.
It's funny, even just looking at these 4 working groups, I'm like, all 4 of those are very important. And I look at the first 3 and I'm like, well, you don't get anywhere if you're not measuring this. You've got to measure this.
Yeah.
That you could guarantee financing for and bipartisan agreement upon. Like, where do you think, when you think about this, what could make the biggest difference? Is there a starting point where you think, okay, if we started with this, we could move from there?
But I went to that question first. I was actually really surprised recently. So we've recently now kind of launched phase 2 of this work.
Well, tell us about that.
Where
It doesn't get you out of the question, but please tell us about
I'm going to
phase
circle
2.
back to the question.
Understood. Yeah.
So we've launched phase 2 of this work. Now that we have the strategy, we're calling it the creatively named Scam Prevention Initiative.
Oh, there you go.
I need you to do some marketing for us. Shamrock is a delightful name.
Easy to remember.
But so the Scam Prevention Initiative is how do we turn strategy into action, right? How do we take this 70 pages of
the next step,
start to bite at it and really look at action oriented steps. And one of the things that I think as a country we need to solve for is how we actually establish the expectations and incentives alignment across sectors, right? If we can get a lot more clear about the rules of the road and the expectations for each of those sectors that are involved to ensure that criminal elements are not exploiting this for the pursuit of consumer harm, honestly, that to me would be enormously helpful for everyone to understand, okay, that's the rule I got to play by. That's the investment I have to make. And I know what is my incentive to do so.
Right.
And I think that to me, because there is, I'll say too, I think a lot of my lens on this has been about what is what within the private sector is a defensive mechanism that we put into place. I think for sure there is a ton to do that is about hitting these criminals where they live and work and dismantling that scam economy where it is. I don't want to discount that. I think that's enormously important work. And also, I think by this work of building the private sector defensive mechanism, that is how you actually erode the scams business model and make it harder, make it costlier, and make it more difficult to rebuild it when it gets torn down.
Those are my words. I say this all the time. I say we've got to make it more expensive, more difficult, and more time consuming for the bad guys to do this work. So
Yeah.
we're aligned there. Is that what you're trying to do? Is that the concept of your group?
So the Scam Prevention Initiative has a couple of kind of buckets of work.
Mm-hmm.
So this first is, what is the leadership group for scam prevention that is really a set of leaders who have said, I'm ready to turn into action and I really need a space to talk to my peers.
Mm-hmm.
Increasingly, this kind of person who's in charge of a scam prevention strategy inside one of these big, national, global companies is
Yeah.
a role. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's really a peer network for those individuals to come together in both dialogue and in action. So that group is just launched. We had our first meeting in May. We'll also have space for sort of more ad hoc roundtables, workshops, dialogues. We're calling them solutions forums, but essentially sort of, as you well know, there's now ever more places where people are convening and bringing together parties to work on solutions. We don't want to duplicate those efforts. We don't want to be redundant. There is enough work for us all to do. So where there is a space where it's helpful for Aspen to convene that group, we will. And we just had one, the Southeast Asian Scam Center Strike Force wanted to have some dialogue with the financial services industry. We gathered them along with the regulators in
Fantastic.
Chatham House
Mm-hmm.
rule conversation about what further work they could be doing together. So
Mm-hmm.
that's an example of where we're happy to bring our convening power, our ability to have those kinds of dialogues and put them to work in that way. And then finally, what's the policy work? How do we continue to educate and build awareness, not just on Capitol Hill, but within the administration, to sort of bring to light, here's what's happening in the private sector, here's where we think there are policy barriers, and here are some things that you could do about it.
Yeah. Now, is this a limited time project? What is the scope of this?
We're a nonprofit. We raised money for a 3-year
Mm-hmm.
initiative. And
Mm-hmm.
so we figure we've got these 3 years. It's
Mm-hmm.
perhaps usefully aligned with this particular presidential administration from a policy standpoint. That might
Right.
be sort of useful to think about it in that kind of time-bound way. We were sort of asking serious questions once the document had been released last fall about, given the growth of other spaces where people were coming together around this topic, was there need for Aspen to be in the room convening anymore? We heard from a number of partners who'd worked with us that they still felt that need was there, and they helped us to kind of think about how do we stay in a lane that's useful. And so we'll reevaluate that ongoing, but then at the end of 3 years we'll think about that again.
Yeah. When you take an 80-page document and then you want to put pieces of it into action, how are you determining which pieces are getting actioned?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I mean, again, I'm going to invoke the notion of like, where is there heat and momentum, right?
Right.
It's
Right.
like,
Yeah.
if there's enough to do, that if there's heat in a certain place, like, let's
Yes.
go add fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
So that's one piece, is just sort of, where are people saying like, I want to get there, but I need some help to get there.
Yeah.
And then 2 is, the other thing we want to be able to do is sort of shine light on spaces where maybe an issue area is lagging behind.
Mm-hmm.
And we might be able to sort of shine a spotlight there, whether that's through storytelling and narrative, or, bringing together some folks to think about some things. So right now we're still in the getting organized and putting fuel to existing fires stage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Before we-
So where would you say right now that there is heat and momentum?
yeah. So data sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all
So-
anyone ever wants to talk about.
I know. So when I started this and I would talk to people and they would say, we only see this, they're only on our platform for this much time. This is exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
But using that in a way of saying, like, we're not responsible for this because they're only here for a limited
Yeah.
amount of time, but they're only in a lot of places for a limited amount of time.
Right.
So when we think of what it is that we want to share, is it as simple as, we want the Instagram handle, we want the IP address, what is it that we're looking to share?
Yeah. So one of the things that we're constructing right now is a set of dialogues that start to break that down a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
My colleague, also named Erin,
Mm-hmm.
likened it to a game of telephone.
Yes.
which I really loved, is
That's a
like,
great, yes.
right? How do you get each participant in this sort of chain, if you will, to say, the thing I need is this. If I knew this information about this thing, then I would be able
Right.
to take this action.
That
And the thing I could maybe give to the next person are these 4 pieces of information.
Right. Here's how I'm identifying the person I'm on the chain with. Yes.
Right? Yeah. And
Mhm.
if we could map that sort of game of telephone and see where there
Mhm.
are nodes that fit together and where they aren't, first of all, illuminating.
Right. Yes.
So yes, it may be as simple as things like, email addresses, IP addresses, et cetera. But even as simple as like if a technology company could say, well, we know that these particular email addresses have been hacked,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
And
So when we see that used, yes.
so if you see that email address used to create an account over here, don't do
It's like
that. Yeah,
right.
as an example, right? So I
Yes.
think it's also just starting to think about what are the signals of something might be wrong,
Mhm.
and how do we send that signal to the next part of the chain? So asking some questions around that. We'll do some things that start to get at how do you help people do that within the context of one specific scam type. The thing I keep sort of seeing over and over and over again is once you start talking about really specific details,
Right.
it becomes super clear whether or not A, there's easy action to be taken,
Yes.
or B, just been talking past each other the whole time.
How do we convince people who or convince entities who might not want to share information that there's value in the collective here? And that how do you do that?
I think it's going to be a multi-pronged approach, and different entities have different roles in that. Right.
Mhm.
I think there's going to
Right.
be one sort of some storytelling among the people
Mhm.
participating in it about
Mhm.
here's the value I got from this.
Right. Right. Here's why it worked.
Here's why it worked. Here's what I was able to do on my platform. And then here's the long tail effect of that in terms of whether it's customer trust or bottom line revenues or, all the things that corporate America will care about. That's one piece of it. I think too, like there's a role here too about storytelling and societal values. Like
Mhm.
what are the kinds of companies and company leadership we want to see in our society?
Mhm.
How do we want people to show up around that? And that sounds lofty, but
I said, yes, I love it when you go big picture on me, Kate, because I was like, yes, yes, that is so important. How in the world what are our baby steps toward that?
baby steps for that. I mean, but it is like, how do we talk about
Right.
scam victim stories? And
Yes.
I think the storytelling is so important. And I think the
Yes.
way that we tell those stories, you do this so beautifully, Erin, that tells fully the story of how did this even happen in the first place?
Right. How did we
That's
get
not
here?
about the victim doing something. That is
Mm-mm.
about how did we allow this to happen in the first place?
Right. How did we
And
get
that
here?
kind of storytelling, I think, we have to keep talking about it that way.
Yeah. So when you think of all of the things that you look at, what seems the most difficult to get consensus on?
Yeah. I mean, I think that we're going to have to grapple with some things in our country that have to do with like consumer data rights
Mm-hmm.
and the tension between privacy and what information we want
Yes.
to have to prevent fraud.
Yeah.
That's one sticky thing that we're going to
Mm-hmm.
have to keep working on.
Yep.
We're going to have to work on, and this seems maybe too grandiose to talk about it this way, but there's also a freedom of speech issue here, right? We've built an internet that allows people to be anonymous,
Right.
and that has allowed the criminal elements to grow in that way.
Mm-hmm.
It's also allowed amazing other things to happen in terms of
Right.
a political freedom of speech that we don't want to lose.
Right.
What's the surgical tool that we're going to use to start to say our society's values are that we don't want criminal elements to steal people's money, so we can't allow this kind of behavior on the internet, right? I think those are going to be some really hard things that we have to deal with because we have legal precedent that is sort of well intentioned
Mm-hmm.
around these ideals of freedom of speech and consumer privacy
Right.
that are having these unintended consequences that we have to deal with. I think those are going to be really hard things, but that they have to be done.
Is there any piece of this that's come easier than you expected?
That's so interesting. There are just so many like really passionate people.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to
It's
say
the
that
people.
there is a lot of really great interest in this space and wanting to do the right thing. Yeah, that surprises me every day.
It surprises me every day. It delights me every day. It gives
Right.
me energy and inspiration every day. But as we've talked about, like this is literally a solution set that's going to get built brick by brick. We need a lot of
Yeah.
bricklayers
Yeah.
and a lot of people to do their one job, right?
Right.
And so having that many passionate, committed people is It's our superpower.
It is. It is. All right. Are you going to answer my question?
Because it's like complicated stuff, but it is like,
Mhm.
how do we actually set up the private sector to know what their expectations are?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And the set of expectations and incentives that align those expectations. I think that's going to be a really big something to propel forward. I think it's also going to be interesting to watch. This is essentially the approach Australia has taken in some respects. And I think it's going to be also really helpful to watch their implementation of that framework.
Yeah, I think so too. So, how long does Kate Griffin stay in this business?
As long as they'll have me. No, it's been a delight to become somebody who has some amount of knowledge in this and to continue learning every day. And we just raised the money for 3 years, so here I am.
I love it. I love it. Thank you for setting aside time to help my
Yes.
listeners understand what is going on and really to show that there is some really important work happening. And I think one of the things that frustrates people the most is it feels so slow.
It does.
It feels like such a glacial pace. And I think it's important to understand that there's a lot going on behind the scenes. You may not get to see everything that's happening, but there is some amazing work that is getting done.
Yeah. I thank you for that. Couldn't agree more. And also, I think people being frustrated about it is useful fuel to keep us all moving as fast as we can.
Well, I got plenty of that fuel.
Great.
So we'll keep moving. So thanks again, Kate. I really appreciate you
You.
being here today.
Thank you.